A clay mug with sour mash left a dark ring on the table in the writing room, where copies of court documents with bold annotations in the margins were bound with thick thread. It smelled of damp parchment, lamp smoke, and the wet wool of the cloak that the policeman had just taken off. On the top sheet, the word decency could be made out, followed by the usual formulas about modesty and the natural order, next to a strip of expenses for the guard and the state bonfire. Between these words and numbers, written in full, the case came together. The body became evidence, the fabric became an argument, the lacing became proof of disobedience. A male voice greets the audience, asks them to briefly write in the comments where they are watching from, and whether they have encountered stories where the rules of propriety were used as a lever of pressure, says that such notes help to distinguish myth from paper, and wishes them calm attention and pleasant listening. A commentator on court records, an adult cleric with tired eyes and firm handwriting, laid out before him copies of the minutes of a trial that took place in the first half of the 15th century, under the rule of the Anglo-Burgundian Union. He was not interested in legends, he was interested in mechanics. What questions were asked, in what order, what topics were pursued with the stubbornness of the chancellery. He made notes in the margins every time the subject of clothing came up. Tunics, doublets, men's cuts, ties on the inside, belts over and under cloaks, buckles that prevented the garment from being removed without the owner's consent. He noted that in camps and on the roads, adult warriors and messengers wore such a system to protect themselves from violence and theft at night. Where it was a safety measure for the road, it became a violation of roles for the court. Excerpts about propriety were read aloud in public squares as if it were a matter of saving morals. The commentator looked closely at the sequence of protocols and saw how everyday norms coincided with the interests of those in power. The English Burgundians needed not the truth of the fabric, but a bridge to the accusation that was understandable to the crowd. He connected questions about dress with points about obedience to the church, lines about modesty with the demand to recognize the legitimacy of the authorities sitting in the occupied city. Thus, everyday language was combined with theological language, and at their intersection, a convenient hook was born. If she violated propriety, it meant she was stubborn. If she was stubborn, it meant she resisted instruction. If she resisted, it meant she fell under the category of heresy. The rhythm was repeated from page to page. As soon as a man's cut was recorded, a few pages later, an attempt was made to cement his stubbornness. Then, his purity of vision was carefully called into question, after which, the way was opened to accusations of disobedience to church authority. The commentator set a trap. Clothing became a test of obedience. This test was more powerful than a dispute over dogma, because it struck at the most visible thing, the body and everyday life. The crowd understood clothing faster than vassal oaths or treatises. Meanwhile, city medical records, which are rarely cited in legends, showed another layer of reality. Adults in prison cells suffered from frostbite, bed sores, and abscesses in winter, and from rashes and fever in summer. Men's clothing with internal ties, if not removed at night, reduced the risk of violence and allowed the wearer to keep their sheath and belt on. Court documents hardly ever mention this directly, but indirect references to belts and ties revealed a concern for physical protection that was turned into an accusation. The commentator wrote in the margins that what the court called indecency was considered reasonable caution in the camp. He compared the dates of the hearings, written out in full, with the anxious weeks when the occupying power needed a spectacular example. It was during such weeks that questions about clothing became obsessive, and moralizing passages were lengthened so that they could be easily read aloud at temples and gates. Thus, moral points turned into traps for heresy. If you agreed to the imposed change of dress, They would recognize the deal and later call it instability. If you refused, they would record your stubbornness and accuse you of heresy. In both cases, the tool served a political purpose. The crowd demanded an example, and the example was made up of details that were easy to point out. Incorrect lacing, someone else's buckle, a belt not where it was expected to be. A memorable legend would later say that they were judged for debauchery because it was easier to pass on the story around the hearth. The papers showed something else. A political process was underway in which modesty was used as leverage. The commentator carefully listed the expenses for guards, firewood, and carpentry, work for the scaffold, noting how church services and city taxes were paid from the same coffers. Execution was an organization of labor and expenses, and it required a justification that was understandable to the public. The crowd does not listen well to disputes over the right to the crown. It listens attentively to disputes over dresses. At the same time, the proceedings themselves revealed timid attempts by individual adult clergymen to steer the conversation back to theology. These appeared as brief digressions, shattered by the growing need for an example. The commentator noted this asymmetry as the main nerve. The meetings were not seeking spiritual salvation. They were seeking a language in which to tell the crowd that the enemy was violating the natural order. When fabric became the argument, there was no need for lengthy explanations. On the edge of the table lay copies of a later rehabilitation, where adult legates acknowledged procedural errors and pointed to coercion through clothing. There, the difference between a security measure and an invented moral guilt was already apparent. The commentator noted, "The myth asserts that she was tried for debauchery. The document shows that she was tried by politics, where modesty was turned into a web of traps. He was gathering material for a future brochure on how clothing and power interlock in a way that is easier to show the people than to explain the law and oaths. All that remained was to tie together public readings on propriety, the rhythm of interrogations, intrusive conditions on changing clothes, and economic lines on expenses. From these dry pieces, a disturbing picture emerged: the body as a poster, clothing as a signature of power, and the court as a printing press, multiplying the desired meaning until it became the only one heard in the square. The commentator laid out several gray copies, with notes on how the questions to the defendant were compiled. The list was not a free interrogation, but a set of articles where everyday topics were repeated with obsessive precision. He drew parallels with the letters of the Anglo-Burgundian administration, where adult chancellors reminded of the need to prevent the strengthening of the symbols of the opposing side. Those letters spoke of order in the cities and how rebellious figures destroy public peace. In the court records, the same thing was unfolded through fabric and belts. The result was a mirror image architecture. In the political document, they demanded that the image be destroyed. In the court document, they turned everyday clothing into a mark of dangerous will. The commentator noted that the coincidence was not accidental, since the legal proceedings were controlled by people who were dependent on Anglo-Burgundian power and needed a process that was understandable to the public. To test his hypothesis, he compared the sequence of hearings with troop movements and news of royal claims. In the weeks when the Anglo-Burgundian side was strengthening its position, pressure on moral points in the interrogations increased. They demanded recognition of the indecent cut, demanded that it be abandoned, and offered a return to familiar clothing as a condition of favor. Where political interests were less intense, the pressure eased. He described this as a curve, where waves of politics pushed waves of moralizing questions. At the same time, he noted that the commission rarely moved on to complex theological topics without first warming up through fabric. First, they demanded that the role be defined, then that obedience be proven, and then that the purity of visions be confirmed. The logic was procedural, clothing as an entrance to a machine from which one emerges already marked. He was particularly interested in the recurring motif of conditions. The materials contained references to the fact that the accused adult woman was offered a change of clothes as a sign of submission, and the next step depended on how she responded. If she agreed, it meant she was wavering. If she disagreed, it meant she was stubborn. In both cases, the protocol received material. The commentator wrote in the margins, "The moral point works as a behind-the-scenes mechanism for heresy." Thus, the everyday symbolism of clothing became the key that opened the door to greater accusations. The technique was also convenient for the crowd. It is easier to talk about fabric than about the subtleties of the power of the Rouen Curia and the sovereign rights of the pretenders. In between, he raised the registers of expenses: money for firewood, ropes, the scaffold, payment for carpenters, reinforced guards, and food for the guards. All this came from the coffers, where city taxes and payments from the administration were combined. Execution required not only a decision, but also management. Management required predictability. Predictability was ensured by clear preaching, where modesty served as the driving force. The commentator avoided loud words in his notes, but calmly recorded the coincidence. On the same days when the pressure on masculine cut was growing in the protocols, accelerated deliveries appeared in the lists of orders for carpenters and guards. This did not mean that the outcome was predetermined down to the last line, but it did indicate that the execution machine was not running alone, but in conjunction with the narrative of propriety. He analyzed medical references that bore no resemblance to legends. Adult prisoners asked for extra fabric during the cold months to protect their bodies, and moved around in cramped cells among straw that bred sores. Clothes sewn in the male style, with internal ties and a belt, prevented unauthorized removal at night. These detailed everyday security strategies were no secret to the guards and clergy, but in interrogations they took on a different meaning. Every emphasis on the male cut was turned into pride and temptation. The commentator left a short note in the margins. A security measure is called a sign of vice. His notes on the crowd were no less sober. In the city, adult men and women were accustomed to spectacles where the culprit became an example. People who receive little bread and many rumors find it easier to perceive punishment through a simple scheme. There is a violation, there is stubbornness, there is purification of the city. By the time rumors about inappropriate clothing spread through the shops, the debate about vassal rights was already considered boring. The commentator noted how the process deliberately pushed towards this outcome. Excerpts about propriety were read aloud. Hints were made about natural roles, and a line was drawn between those who were restrained and those who were provocative. As the crowd became ready, the legal mechanism accelerated. Then, in the proceedings, there was an episode with a new wave of pressure. They offered to renounce masculinity as a condition for mercy. The commentator carefully reconstructed how this condition was incorporated into the proceedings. The minutes recorded every refusal and every hesitation of the adult witnesses, so that it could later be linked to stubbornness. He recalled similar techniques from urban trials against those considered freethinkers. There, too, they began with everyday matters, an indecent song or an inappropriate gesture, and ended with politics. The connecting link was modesty, which was turned into an administrative tool. His comparisons with the letters of university theologians revealed another layer. Where scholars discussed order and class differences, court records placed belts and buckles side by side. A bridge was formed between abstractions and the craftsmanship of clothing. This bridge was used to transfer the accusation from the realm of political distrust to that of religious danger. As a result, any attempts to defend the practical side of clothing choices were declared secondary or suspicious. The commentator noted the reclassification of everyday life into theology. Meanwhile, the demand for examples grew in the city. Guards worked their shifts, carpenters prepared structures, and preachers duplicated the terminology of protocols in their teachings. The commentator did not seek mysticism in this. He saw the coordination of institutions. Where the process had a chance to drag on in dogmatic dispute, everyday matters accelerated the course. A body dressed inappropriately became a convenient indicator of heresy for the uninitiated public. It was the language of posters, not treatises. In his private notes, he recorded an important nuance. When an accused adult woman, isolated and vulnerable, chose clothing that protected her from violence and public humiliation, this choice was criminally elevated to the level of obstinacy. This technique allowed them to avoid discussing actual safety and instead discuss the appearance of obedience. Where people in uniforms and robes ruled, appearances were considered sufficient. He underlined this with a double line and added, "Here they don't touch dogmas, here they touch fabric." At the end of this part, his table looked like a stitched collage. Interrogation reports with an emphasis on tailoring, letters from the administration calling for order, economic reports accumulating before execution days, medical records on the consequences for adult prisoners, and underneath it all, the rhythm of a crowd waiting for a simple image. From all this, a conclusion emerged that was not intended for beautiful legends, but was suitable for the brochure he was going to publish later. The dispute over clothing was not about ethics, but about management. Modesty became a cog in the machine, and the machine served a political purpose. And if we do not separate the myth of debauchery from the meeting minutes, it will be impossible to understand why on some days phrases about mercy were crafted, and on others, more firewood was ordered. The commentator returned to the most controversial issue, the protocol on the return to women's dresses and the subsequent breach of promise. He laid out 3 copies of the same episode side by side, comparing the formulas and word order. In some lists, canonical vocabulary about obedience prevailed, while in others, there were practical notes about the transfer of clothing and the fastening of belts. He was not interested in the plot of the legend, but in the place where an everyday object was turned into a legal lever. He noted that the promise in the clothing case was created procedurally. First, an adult captive, exhausted by imprisonment and fear, was offered the mercy of the opportunity to return to a certain style of dress. Then this step was recorded as consent, and then, at the first sign of a security breach or provocation, the return to the masculine was recorded as evidence of obstinacy. This is how they built a formal bridge from fabric to accusation of heresy without theological discussion. The commentator's notebook contained the formula: moral point, condition, fixation, reclassification as heresy. He compared it to the prison regime. Medical notes and prison records, written in the dry handwriting of adult officials, spoke of night checks, changing of the guard, cramped conditions, and the constant threat of harassment. The internal fastening and belt, designed for men, were not aesthetic. They were a lock against hands. Where the investigation called this insubordination, prison practice saw it as simple protection of the adult body. The commentator noted one indicator. On days when prison administrators changed shifts, there were more frequent references to a return to masculinity, followed by a surge in moralizing passages in the protocols. His conclusion was unheroic. Human vulnerability became the driving force behind a legal trap. The political background made this trap even more effective. Anglo-Burgundian interests demanded a convincing example that could be communicated to the market and the parish. The commentator noted how the sermons were synchronized with the hearings. On days when the court was moving toward establishing stubbornness through clothing, the pulpits explained natural roles and modesty as a measure of obedience. For a crowd tired of campaigns and expensive taxes, this line of reasoning was clear. Violating decency meant stubbornness. Stubbornness meant heresy, and heresy meant purifying the city with fire. He did not need to dramatize to see how the language of everyday morality obscured complex questions of law. At that moment, the body as evidence became not a metaphor, but a technology of public persuasion. He analyzed letters from university theologians, in which adult scholars proposed subtle distinctions between states and roles, and suddenly saw how, in court documents, belts, buckles, and cuts lay next to these abstractions. This proximity was not accidental. The longer the theological explanation, the easier it was to lose the crowd. The simpler the belt and lace, the faster the understandable sin appeared. The commentator noted that the protocols almost never allowed clothing to be discussed as a means of defense. They invariably translated it into a sign of resistance. He called this an administrative allegory. An everyday object, deprived of context, became a symbol of guilt. He then examined the procedure for issuing the ruling. The documents mentioned adult jurors, witnesses, and notaries. Their work was divided into days, indicated by words. It was on the planning days preceding key steps that orders appeared for carpenters to leave, for firewood to be prepared, and for guards to be reinforced. The commentator did not jump to conclusions about a predetermined outcome, but noted a correlation. The more insistently the court steered the conversation toward clothing, the closer the city was preparing for a spectacular outcome. This conveyor belt synchronization of institutions, the curia, city services, preachers, guards, meant that the example for the crowd was constructed as a practical operation, rather than a sudden flash of justice. At the same time, he found traces of internal resistance. Among the marginalia were cautious remarks by adult clerics that it was risky to link clothing with heresy, that theology was not the same as wardrobe. But these remarks were drowned out by the economic routine of the process. Where estimates and security schedules were laid on the table, cautious doubts lost their weight. The commentator noted that the mechanism did not simply exert pressure, it replaced content with form. Instead of analyzing visions, the lacing was analyzed. This was the victory of administration over theology, for which the adult prisoners paid with their lives. He returned to the crowd again to understand the psychology of the example. The city, filled with adult craftsmen, merchants, and mercenaries, needed a clear, concise story. This story was given a theme, indecency, and a visual anchor, men's clothing. The verification of everyday life turned into a ritual of guilt that the viewer could retell at home without quoting Latin treatises. In this sense, clothing was the ideal vehicle for accusation. It is visible, it is everyday, it can be divided according to the criteria of one's own and another's. The commentator wrote, "Visibility is the currency of the process." His analysis reached a turning point when he superimposed a time series of interrogations on a list of moral requirements. It turned out that every time it seemed that theology would have to be addressed in substance, the machine would bring up the issue of clothing again. The transition was disrupted. The crowd got a new reason to smile and whisper, and the protocol got another record of stubbornness. Thus, the moral points finally became traps for heresy. Not only did they open the door to accusations, they closed the door to discussion of the essence of faith. The last barrier between the everyday and the political collapsed. What remained was a stage on which the opposing side was portrayed as a threat to the natural order. At the edge of these sheets, the commentator began to sketch out a plan for a future pamphlet. He had to explain a simple thing to the public without embellishment. The dispute over clothing here was not a dispute over morality, but an engineering of control. He gathered 5 points of support: public readings on propriety as preparation for hearing, comparison of court issues with the interests of the Anglo-Burgundians, transformation of moral points into a technology for fixing stubbornness, launching the crowd at the demand for example, and finally, the economic basis of enforcement. Each pillar was based on boring documents and adult, specific, procedural decisions. In this series, the legend looked like a short song, and the case looked like a long accounting. Moving his elbow, he reread the list of his own footnotes, where he noted the medical consequences for adult prisoners, organizational costs, the formula, condition, fixation, retraining, and realized that the conflict had matured not in the legend, but in management. The crowd would demand an example because it had been given a clear signal. The court would set an example because it was as predictable as the planting and harvesting calendar. And only paper, which had nowhere to rush, would keep this scheme in sight, so that years later, someone in that very same room could show how clothing had been made into evidence of politics. This is how his second round of analysis ended and the third began, where it was necessary to analyze not how the trap was constructed, but how and why it was accepted as the norm. He turned to the fragments about public readings and noticed how the rhythm of the city changed a few days before the decisive meetings. In temples and at the gates, excerpts about propriety were read aloud, gently reminding adult listeners about the division of roles, order, and obedience. The commentator compared these dates, recorded in words, with the prison guard's diary and the supply orders. The curves ran parallel. On the day when the sermons emphasized the theme of modesty, the prison received more straw and rope. The carpenters received an advance for repairing the flooring, and the guards received extra rations. This was not a secret agreement, but rather a coordination between institutions, in which the moral rhythm was adjusted in advance to the technical rhythm of punishment. He noted the ruthless simplicity of such a mechanism. It was enough to direct the crowd's attention to the dress, to allow the administration to launch the expenditure as if at the request of the public itself. He then analyzed the scheme of pressure through consent. One set of protocols recorded a return to women's dresses, while another recorded a voluntary return to men's clothing. Between them lay days filled with nightly checks and careless or deliberately provocative manipulations with the lacing. The commentator noted how an adult captive was placed in a position of constant vulnerability, where false consent became currency, and any failure turned into proof of stubbornness. He wrote down the formula. When physical safety depends on the cut and ties, and control belongs to those who are able to violate it, any movement of the body under supervision is recorded as a sign of will. Legal fixation replaced the actual possibility of choice. To show how this substitution became the norm, he analyzed letters from church officials in which adult clergy discussed the danger of bad examples. These letters expressed concern about the corruption of the weak, and the commentator saw how the concept of weak was extensively applied to the entire city. The broader the weakness, the broader the legitimacy of correction. Then a mundane detail, a belt, ties, cut, became a demonstrative button that triggered a consistent explanation. Disobedience is not in dogma. Disobedience is in visible things. He noted how this solved the main political task of the Anglo-Burgundians, to defang the symbol of resistance without complex disputes about legitimacy. When the body is marked with incorrect clothing, the crowd has already received the key to interpretation, and further, theological constructions only reinforce the ready-made conclusion. Meanwhile, the economic canvas did not let go. He raised the lists of purchases of firewood and the construction of premises for storing execution equipment. There were amounts written out in words and deadlines checked by weeks. Adult craftsmen reported on the days when they delivered boxes, reinforced posts, and tested mechanisms. He did not make a sensation out of these lines. He emphasized that the punishment was an administrative project that required cash planning. For such a project, it is more convenient to have a charge that does not require subtle analysis. Clothing solved this problem. Visible, simple, suitable for repetition in sermons and leaflets, it turned political repression into a lesson in modesty. In the city, the need for an example grew layer by layer. A commentator observing the square saw how adult craftsmen and merchants picked up the rhythm. By evening, reinforced guards appeared, and by morning, there was talk that order would be restored. He noted how the talking heads at the market corners repeated the vocabulary of the protocols, in which masculine dress was objectified as a violation of the established order. There was no debate here about the subtle differences between vow and custom. Here, a universally accessible taxonomy of visible signs reigned supreme. He separately wrote out a sequence of failures in attempts to take the process to a theological level. Every time the defenders tried to insist on questions about visions, conscience, and the will of heaven, the machine brought the conversation back to clothing. A simple loop emerged, from clothing to stubbornness, from stubbornness to harmful independence, from there to dangerous influence, and then to the need to cleanse the city. The adult jurors, tired from long sessions and under pressure from the administration, agreed to this shortcut because it saved time and resources and met the expectations of the crowd. The commentator noted that efficiency was replacing justice. He did not limit himself to letters and protocols. He cross-referenced these records with doctors' reports and guards' reports on injuries to adult detainees. These indicated that on the nights preceding key hearings, there was an increase in complaints of bruises, abrasions, colds, and insomnia. He included this data in the overall array, not out of compassion, but for the sake of accuracy. The process, which was based on modesty, turned out to be a burden on the bodies that remained locked up at night. Thus, political engineering shifted the costs to those who had no protection and monetized them as a moral spectacle. Finally, he brought up rare notes about doubts within the Curia itself. Where adult canonists cautiously wrote about the risks of mixing disciplinary and dogmatic matters, the commentator put exclamation marks. These lines showed that the manipulation of norms was recognized not only by critics, but also by part of the system. However, the power of procedure outweighed doubt. His tables were convincing. When political power links theological outcome with everyday testing, testing wins. The body loses because it must serve as a mark. With this knowledge, he returned to the structure of the story he had conceived for a future brochure. He needed to convey the idea to the reader without embellishment. The dispute over clothing became a key instrument of political accusation because it linked a visible sign to a controllable outcome. For the crowd, it was simple theater. For the administration, it was convenient accounting. For the court, it was a short path from decency to heresy. The commentator wrote down the last line at this stage. If this connecting cord is not broken, the city will continue to confuse concern for conscience with editing the wardrobe and legitimacy with a successful staging in the square. All that remained for him to do was to take the next step, to move from marginal notes to a coherent report in which the myth of debauchery would clash with the driest mass of paper. He began to compile the material into a coherent narrative, leaving aside legends and everyday tales. On the first page, he placed public readings on propriety as preparation for the ear. On the second, a sequence of interrogations, where everyday tests were translated into theological danger. On the third, financial statements with amounts written in words. On the fourth, medical records about the consequences for adult prisoners. On the fifth, notes about how the crowd was getting ready to demand an example. He described how the same running lines were repeated, a reminder of natural roles in temples, then reinforcement in the protocols of points about clothing, then fixation on persistence, parallel acceleration of purchases for execution, and finally, the noisy rush of the square toward purification. This mechanism was low on emotion and rich in coincidences. He did not need loud words to show that the dispute over fabric served as a short transition from a visible sign to a political verdict. Then, he brought out the conditions scheme in a separate section. Adult female prisoners in damp cells were offered mercy in exchange for returning to women's clothing. Layers of damp straw, nightly checks, fear of harassment and humiliation made clothing with internal fastenings an elementary lock. When a fastening was broken or a belt disappeared under supervision, the protocols recorded a return to the masculine and immediately included rhetoric about stubbornness. The commentator described that this was not an entrepreneurial invention of later pamphlets, but an actual procedure visible at the intersection of prison notes, economic invoices, and court formulas. Where modesty was discussed, a model of dependent consent was actually being worked out. A vulnerable body, a controlled tie, the recording of disobedience, and its translation into a theological category. This logic did not need subtleties. It needed repeatability. And it was precisely this repeatability that gave the administrative machine an advantage over any apology. He added to the body of evidence, showing how adult preachers mirrored the vocabulary of the protocols. On the days when the condition was recorded, the city resounded with exhortations of humility and obedience, without mentioning names or details. The public was encouraged to think about roles rather than rights. Any attempt to defend the practicality of men's clothing for safety reasons was declared an act of malice. In his notes, the commentator called this visibility hygiene. Anything that improves everyday safety but hides access for surveillance is marked as dangerous because it interferes with demonstrative obedience. Thus, the debate about clothing did not simply replace theology. It clarified the political goal. Those who do not give surveillance free access to the body do not give the authorities free access to the minds of the crowd. It did not ignore the economics of spectacle. For the city treasury, public example had a price: firewood, boards, fastenings, reinforced guards, payment to craftsmen. All this formed an expense that needed to be justified by understandable income, respect for order, obedience, and predictable fear. When the accusation was based on subtle theological disputes, this conversion did not work well. When the accusation was based on incorrect knotting and foreign tailoring, the conversion worked quickly. The commentator compared the curves. The shorter the chain from decency to stubbornness, the more stable the city's mechanism for organizing executions was, and the less theological effort was required. He provided this part of the text with a tabular remark, where words and dates stood side by side, without emotional adjectives, so as not to give cause to accuse him of bias. At the level of crowd psychology, he described a line familiar to all cities. The clearer the sign, the easier the mobilization. The sign of clothing worked instantly, because it lived on bodies and was at hand as an example for any preacher. Adult craftsmen and mercenaries did not need commentary on the canons. They needed a gesture that could be repeated in conversation at the market. Thus, men's cut became an abbreviation for any ignored defense argument. And the more often this abbreviation was used, the easier it was to forget that the original question of the trial was not about cutting and sewing, but about rights and power. Having gathered enough material, he moved on to a model of conflict. On one sheet, he showed how a crowd is brought to a predictable readiness. On another, he showed how jurors, everyday tired adult men, choose the short path because it coincides with the economic calendar. On the third, he showed how the administration synchronizes sermons, prison regime, and purchases for execution. At the center of this knot was the formula on which the outcome depended. If the body is recognized as correct only when it is freely accessible for supervision, any other cut will be recognized as stubbornness, which means that the bridge to heresy has already been built. The commentator left a stern remark next to this formula. Such an interpretation of modesty destroys the boundaries between personal safety and public loyalty, which is precisely why it is convenient as a political tool. At the end of this part, he outlined the boundaries between myth and paper. The myth demanded that the process be called punishment for debauchery because it was concise and captivating. The paper insisted on something else: the consistent subjugation of fabrics and bodies to administrative necessity was played out before society. The myth shifted the focus to morality. The document returned to the technique of control. He prepared the transition to the finale, where he would explain how the collection of remarks grew into the brochure Clothing and Power, how it described the scheme of manipulating norms without embellishment, and how, years later, the courier was forced to admit that modesty had been used as leverage in this case. All that remained was to assemble the scattered tables into a neat row so that the reader would see not a monument to legend, but a conveyor belt on which decency was turned into heresy, circumstances into stubbornness, and example into a justification of inevitability.